Hey everybody, what's going on? Hellmite here, bringing you another video from Grab the Lantern today. Today I wanted to finally give my guide on how to counter Smolder in your own games, as Smolder is quickly shaping up to be one of the premier bot lane carries of League of Legends. This is in part due to his diverse damage profile, his hyperscaling nature, and the fact that he deals a significant amount of area of effect damage, all from the AD carry slot, which is typically not known for any of these traits. Despite having all of these advantages versus other picks, however, Smolder is not an unbeatable champion. In today's video, I'm going to talk through some general counterplay and how you can handle Smolder, talk through each of his abilities so that you know how you can counterplay them in your own games, and then give you an idea about what kind of counterpicks you should be employing when the Fiery Fledgling is picked up by the enemy team. First up, let's talk some general counterplay. First of all, Smolder is a hyperscaling carry pick, which means he's devastating in the late game, but relatively weak early. Most Smolders in lane just want to stack passive and hit their first Q evolution as fast as possible. As a result, if you see a Smolder picked on the enemy team, you should be picking into an early game composition to try and smash him as fast as possible. If you don't have the luxury of choosing early game champions, say for example the Smolder is a relatively late pick, you should still be trying to end the game as quickly as possible and be proactive about it. Don't durdle around and say, oh, well, we're so far ahead, there's no way we could possibly lose this game. That's exactly how you lose a game against Smolder, is letting him scale and reach the late game power spike where he's actually very strong. Though it may be tempting to try and match the Smolder late game with a similar scaling pick, for example, picking Kog'Maw or picking Kayle, Smolder has an advantage against most late game champions because he infinitely scales. A Kog'Maw, for example, will hit a power cap, but Smolder won't. So again, you want to be trying to play for the early or mid game victory, as opposed to trying to scale late against a Smolder, which means you should be trying to proactively end games as opposed to stick around and allow him to scale. Secondly, you need to try and space yourself out from the rest of your team against a Smolder. In between his Q's juicy area of effect, his W and his R, Smolder packs a ton of area effect damage in his kit. His Q is also a relatively low cooldown, meaning that even after he throws out his W and his R, he can still hit multiple champions with regularity. As a result, you need to try and keep space between yourself and the rest of your team, otherwise Smolder will start DPSing down your entire team at the same time, which is definitely not the scenario you want to end up in. Diving Smolder is a pretty effective way of dealing with him as well. He isn't completely immobile, but he's still relatively weak to being dove because he's squishy and wants to keep foes at his maximum attack range. If you can get in his face, it's a good way to put pressure on Smolder, which can force him to pop his E to try and get away, and potentially therefore making enough space between you and him that he can't meaningfully participate in the fight afterwards, even if you can't actually kill him. Of note as well, his E grants him bonus movement speed and is not a dash. This means that if you slow him, his E won't carry him as far as it would ordinarily, though he can still go over walls with it. Smolder's also an ability caster, not really an auto-attack caster. He's more of a spellslinger champion like Lucian, rather than a meat grinder like champion like Xayah or Kog'Maw, who mostly rely on their auto-attacks for their overall DPS. As a result, he's less vulnerable to abilities that affect auto-attacks, such as Nasus Wither, Malphite Ground Slam, or Frozen Heart, and more vulnerable to things that affect ability usage, like a Soraka E. This is something to consider. I'm not going to say this is going to meaningfully make a difference in your own games, but it does mean that if you see a Smolder picked and you're like, oh, I'll just grab a Nasus to wither him, that's not as effective as choosing something else instead. Finally, Smolder has a mixed damage profile. He basically deals a relevant amount of all damage sources, physical, magic, and true, but he doesn't unlock the true damage upgrade until much later in the game. As a result, if you have to tank a Smolder, make sure that you're itemizing health instead of over-indexing in a specific resist, because otherwise he'll auto-attack you if you build lots of magic resistance, and he'll ability you down with his abilities in the event that you build lots of armor, so do keep this in mind. Health is probably going to be your best bet against him overall. Let's move on to talking about Smolder's abilities specifically, starting off with his passive Dragon Practice. Now, obviously, this isn't really a counterplayable ability, but there are a few notes I want to make about it. First is that Smolder gets stacks for lasting with his Q and affecting enemy champions with his abilities. This means that if you can zone him off the wave, he can't stack Q as effectively because he can't get in range to actually use his Q to last hit minions, and therefore he's not stacking his passive as quickly. His Q also significantly changes based on stacks, but the rest of his abilities merely get stronger damage-wise, which means that, again, his abilities are all getting strong with stacks, not just his Q, though his Q changes more dramatically. And also, this ability does not grant Smolder a stat. For example, Vhagar passive gives him ability power, but Smolder does not get a stat. He just gets stacks of Dragon Practice that his abilities have scalings with. As a result, he doesn't scale on a one-to-one basis with his stacks, so stack count is a good way to know his general power level, but it isn't completely accurate because you won't actually know what that means as far as Smolder's overall damage. Generally, more stacks good, fewer stacks bad. Keep this in mind. Moving on to Smolder's Q. This is his bread and butter ability, and so there's a bunch to discuss here. First, this ability applies on hit effects. This is going to include Sheen and Red Buff, and is targeted, so there's not a ton you can do to outplay it. The range is based off of Smolder's auto attack range. This is relevant for things like rapid fire cannon, but it doesn't mean that if you're outside of Smolder's range, he can't actually hit you with this ability because he has to have you in auto range before he can use his Q. Secondly, this ability changes based on Smolder stacks. I'm going to try and avoid quoting exact numbers as they may or may not change in the future, but keep in mind, in general, the first upgrade he'll get, which will happen very early in lane, gives Smolder's Q an area of effect to hit all enemies near the target. This means that if you're standing directly next to minions, he can still splash damage onto you with his Q at the stage. Not super relevant, but is something to consider. At the second upgrade, Smolder's Q fires secondary explosions that affect targets in a cone behind the initial target. This does deal reduced damage, but it does mean that if you're standing behind minions even further away than you were previously, he can still hit you, and this is also the biggest upgrade for Smolder, as it allows him to splash that damage across your entire team when necessary. These upgrades are also very relevant for Smolder because they give his Q area of effect. This means that once he gets his first upgrade, he theoretically can last hit 2 to 3 minions per Q. On his second upgrade, he can theoretically be last hitting like entire waves with his Q, which means that he dramatically starts increasing how many stacks he can get over time once he gets his the upgrades on his Q. The final upgrade of Smolder's Q applies a true damage dot based on percent max health to targets it hits, and it will execute the target if they fall below a percent health threshold. This is the scariest part of Smolder's Q by far. It means that not only does he do a significant amount of max health true damage, but he can apply this in an area of effect, meaning that if you're with your whole team, you can splash this true damage dot across everybody on that team. It will hurt whether you're a tank or a squishy, and the execute also means that you're effectively fighting against a champion that has a mini Elder Dragon buff for the rest of the game, period. This is very, very scary, of course, but the burn is relatively short-lived, and it is only applied by his Q. This means that if you get outside of his range after he applies it once, you're probably not going to get executed, and even if you take things like Smolder's R or W damage, you're not going to die from that, right? That isn't necessarily going to reapply the burn, so there are ways for you to deal with it. This final upgrade as well, despite being a late game upgrade, is reliable to get. I can reliably get it at around the 30-minute mark, which means that it isn't a hyper late game upgrade. You can expect Smolder to have access to this effect in every single game, and as a result, you should be proactive about ending games early against a Smolder before he's able to get this upgrade, or minimum very shortly after he gets this upgrade. Moving on to Smolder's W. This ability has a relatively long range and large projectile size, but it does have a small wind-up animation and a relatively sluggish projectile speed, which makes it decently dodgeable. There are two important notes here. The projectile slows down at the end of its duration and lingers for a brief duration thereafter. This means that running directly away from it can work in some circumstances, but it also means that it will hang out for a brief period of time afterwards and potentially block your path forward if, for example, you're trying to chase down a Smolder and he W'd through a choke point. Secondly, if it hits a champion, the W creates a secondary explosion that damages and slows units around them. Again, this means that staying away from your friends will help limit the area of effect damage that Smolder can deal. Otherwise, you're potentially doubling up on all the damage he deals, right? You both get hit by a W, you both have the secondary explosions, you both take the secondary explosion damage, lots of extra damage that the Smolder W can throw out if you're clumped up. This is a fairly useful tool for Smolder to have to peel with, but Smolder players tend to fire this off this cooldown for poke, and as a result, you won't have to play around it as much when you go for the dive because you can sort of wait for Smolder to use it. They will, because they want stacks, and then you can go for the dive right afterwards. Next up is Smolder's E, which is his primary escape tool. It does come with damage, but you can mostly ignore that. It basically tickles at all stages of the game, but there are a couple of important notes here as well. First off, this ability is not a dash. It just gives bonus movement speed and lets him move across terrain for the duration. Again, this means that abilities that slow him, so for example a Nasus W or Smite if you're a jungler, will affect how far away he can get from you when he uses this. So if you're able to get on his face, smite him, or use a slow immediately, because then when he uses his E to try and make space, it won't carry him away as far. This also means it's unaffected by things that affect dashes. So Poppy W, for example, does nothing to Smolder. It is not counting as a dash. Secondly, just because it's movement, this means Smolder can change direction freely over the duration of this ability. So we can juke abilities or go from fleeing to following or vice versa over the duration of this cooldown. This means that just because he pops it, you can't guaranteed know where he's going or what he's doing because he can't adjust it mid-flight. Do keep this in mind and don't get jebaited. Finally, let's talk about Smolder's ultimate. This ability has an exceptionally long range. If you can hear Smolder calling for Mom, it means you are in range of this ability, and so you should have your dancing shoes on and be ready to dodge, even if you think you're safe enough. If you hear Mom, you are not safe enough. Secondly, there is a sweet spot on this ability in the center. Even if you don't think you can dodge the ability entirely, getting to one side can limit the damage you take. And Smolder will heal if he's in the area of effect of this ability. It's not a huge heal, but it will come up as something that you have to keep in mind if you go for the dive on the Smolder, is that he's just slightly tankier than you may otherwise expect if he's able to stand in Mom's area of effect. He can also combo his W into this ability, so if you take a max range W, he can then call for Mom, fly forward, take the heal, you take the damage, and slow from Mom as well. Now Smolder's in auto attack range, right? Like, there are some scary things he can do with this ability overall, so it is a cooldown you should be expecting him to use in this kind of manner. Finally, let's talk about some counter picks for Smolder, and there are more of these than you may expect. First off, aggressive bot lanes will have a field day with Smolder and can end games fast enough to stop him from reaching his power spikes, or at least push back his stacking until much later in the game than normal. Basically, any combination of aggressive bot laners will deal with Smolder. Draven Leona, Samira Rel, Caitlyn Lux, right? Like, all of these are going to be good, so just choose based on your personal preferences, because as long as you're picking something that is going to be aggressive early, you are going to have an advantage into Smolder. Divers and Assassins can find decent success against Smolder as well. He is a marksman after all, and marksmen are weak to these champions. There is a caveat here in that he does have some mobility, so simply getting onto his face isn't a guarantee of success. For example, a Jarvan flag and drags onto Smolder's face, but then Smolder just flies away immediately afterwards and ignores your Cataclysm, so like, Jarvan clearly isn't a good pick in this scenario, right? Comparatively, champions with other multiple gap closers are good choices. Vi with Vault Breaker into Cease and Desist, Hecarim with Devastating Charge into Onslaught of Shadows, Camille with Hookshot into Hextech Ultimatum, right? Like, these abilities that you can use to immediately get on the champion, and then when he pops his mobility, you have something afterwards to follow up on. These champions are very powerful into Smolder, not least of which because they do high amounts of damage, and can be relatively tanky if they absolutely need to, which I think is a good combination into Smolder. Finally, champions with wind walls are actually quite effective against Smolder because everything he does gets blocked by them, even his mom. Mom's damage is wind wallable, so if you are a Yasuo one-trick, if you're a Samira aficionado, or if you're just a Braum enjoyer, you can use your abilities to block off literally everything Smolder does can be blocked with a well-timed wind wall or wind wall-esque ability, so do keep this in mind. That's going to be it for me today, guys, though. Let me know what you thought of this down in the comment section below and what your own tips for dealing with Smolder are in your own games. I'd love to hear your thoughts. If you enjoyed the video today, go ahead and leave it a like. And if you really enjoyed the video, consider subscribing. I upload a video every Monday, Friday, and on patch days as well. Once again, thank you guys so very much for watching. I do appreciate it. And I'll talk to you all later.